Good morning. Just want to walk through the process here today. It's a little unusual. So we're standing by right now. We expect to see General Campbell shortly. He's going to be coming out and making a brief statement, and then he's going to be turning it over to General Schaffner for questions and answers after that. I think a lot of you understand the reason for that. He, as the commander, is limited in what he's allowed to say. But we are very interested in making sure that we get a chance to hear your questions. We'll be starting from there, just simply listening in for the opening statement and for a couple of questions there from Kabul. And then they will turn over to us. We're going to get a few questions here and then turn it back over to them for additional questions from the Afghan press corps. So we'll be doing a lot of listening to them, but we will have an opportunity here to ask questions from this end as well. So bear with us if you will. We're going to be waiting for General Campbell.
Okay. Rose, you turn them up for a sec. RS, this is Pentagon Press Corps. This is RS HQ. Can you read me? Can you read me? Over.
We've got you loud and clear from the Pentagon briefing room.
Okay, just wanted to check with you. We're going to keep you down, and then when you hear, your audio will be off the whole time until Colonel Lawhorn cues you for a question. So you can talk all you want there. We won't hear you. So when Colonel Lawhorn cues you, then you'll be on. All right?
Hear you.
Can you hear me? All right.
Pentagon.
My name is Colonel Mike Lawhorn. I'm the Director of Public Affairs here at Resolute Support in U.S. Forces Afghanistan. Before we get started, I have a few administrative announcements. If you haven't already, please take this time to turn off your electronic devices. I know some of you are going to use your phones to record, and that's okay. I just ask that you turn the ringers off on the phones. Sequence of events will be joined by General Campbell, and then General Schaffner will take some questions and answers. I'll serve as the moderator for the question and answer portion. I'd ask that when I call on you, you please say your name and your outlet for the record. And in the interest of time, please limit your questions to one follow-up. Also, as you've seen already, we have some tenuous connections with the Pentagon Press Corps, so I'd ask that it's quiet while the Pentagon Press Corps is asking questions, or while someone in the room is asking questions so that the folks at the Pentagon can hear that as well. For photography, if you want to come around to the side during the event, that's fine. I would ask that you not come past the corner here in the front. And in the interest of courtesy for the cameras and the other journalists, I'd ask you to come up, take your photo, and please return to your seat. At this point, we'll be joined by General Campbell.
Well, good evening and good morning back in Washington, D.C. I received the report of the U.S. National Investigation into the strike on Doctors Without Borders MSF Trauma Center in Kunduz City, Afghanistan on October 3rd, 2015. Let me start by offering my sincere condolences to the victims of this devastating event. No nation does more to prevent civilian casualties than the United States, but we failed to meet our own high expectations on October 3rd. This was a tragic but avoidable accident caused primarily by human error. It was important that the officers investigating the incident have the requisite seniority and independence to conduct a thorough and unbiased inquiry. For that reason, I requested an outside investigative team. U.S. Central Command supported my request and sent an Army Major General independent of U.S. Forces Afghanistan to lead the investigation. He was assisted by 2 Brigadier Generals, one from the Army and one from the Air Force, also outside from my command. The report included specific findings relating to systems, processes, and personnel, and I've already approved some of the findings and recommendations. Based on the recommendations, I've already directed some immediate changes to ensure we learn and apply the right lessons from this incident. In addition to the U.S. National Investigation, the NATO and Afghan Partner Combined Civilian Casualty Assessment Team, or CCAT, also conducted an investigation. The findings of both reports were generally consistent. I have personally briefed the NATO Secretary General, General Breedlove Sakur, President Ghani, and Dr. Abdullah on the results of the CCAT. NATO will release the CCAT report in the coming days. Also earlier today, I briefed MSF on the results of the U.S. national and CCAT investigations. Recommendations dealing with systems and processes will be managed within this command and adopted consistent with current operations. Matters regarding individual accountability will be managed in accordance with standard military justice and administrative practices for joint commands. I have decided to refer some of the recommendations to the Commander, U.S. Special Operations Command, for his review and action as appropriate. I won't discuss individual cases because our system requires fairness and the discretion of individual decision makers. I can tell you that those individuals most closely associated with the incident have been suspended from their duties, pending consideration and disposition of administrative and disciplinary matters. Because I am still in the process of reviewing the investigative report and the investigating officer's report, I will defer any questions today to my spokesperson, Brigadier General Schaffner, as mentioned earlier. That said, I'm able to provide an accounting of the events on October 3rd, 2015. The report determined that U.S. strike upon the MSF Trauma Center in Kunduz City, Afghanistan, was the direct result of human error compounded by systems and procedural failures. The U.S. forces directly involved in this incident did not know the targeted compound was the MSF Trauma Center. The medical facility was misidentified as a target by U.S. personnel who believed they were striking a different building several hundred meters away where there were reports of combatants. The report also determined that the personnel who requested the strike and those who executed it from the air did not undertake the appropriate measures to verify that the facility was a legitimate military target. It's important to place the events leading up to this tragic incident in context. On the evening of September 27th, Kunduz City was suddenly attacked by a significant force of Taliban and associated insurgents. By the evening of September 28th, local Afghan forces quickly withdrew, leaving the Taliban in control of most of the city. On September 29th, MSF sent the coordinates of their trauma center in Kunduz to multiple recipients within the U.S. and NATO chains of command. Those coordinates were received and distributed by this headquarters to subordinate headquarters. United States Special Operations Forces and their Afghan counterparts were rapidly deployed to a camp adjacent to the Kunduz airfield in the early morning on September 29th. By that evening, they were forced to defend the Kunduz airfield from a Taliban attack. U.S. SOF maintained defensive positions at the airfield throughout the night until the early morning on September 30th. Later that day, U.S. SOF and their Afghan counterparts moved from the airfield into the city and established themselves in the Provincial Chief of Police, or PCOP, compound. Between the time that the team was established in the PCOP compound and the time of the incident on October 3rd, U.S. and partners repelled heavy and sustained enemy attacks and conducted multiple defensive strikes in Kunduz. By October 3rd, U.S. SOF had remained at the PCOM compound longer than intended in continued support of Afghan forces. As a result, by the early morning hours of October 3rd, U.S. SOF at the PCOP compound had been engaged in heavy fighting for nearly 5 consecutive days and nights. During the evening of October 2nd, Afghan SOF advised the U.S. SOF commander that they intended to conduct a clearing operation that night. This included a former National Directorate of Security, or NDS, headquarters building they believed was occupied by insurgents. The Afghans requested U.S. close air support as they conducted their clearing operation. The U.S. SOF commander agreed to have the support on standby. He remained at the PCOP compound during the operation and was beyond the visual range of either the NDS headquarters or the MSF Trauma Center as he monitored the progress of his Afghan counterparts. The report found that from this point forward, multiple errors occurred that ultimately resulted in the misidentification of and the strike on the MSF Trauma Center. First, the AC-130 aircraft designated to provide close air support in Kunduz City launched 69 minutes early in response to a troops in contact situation. This type of emergency requires an immediate response. But the result was that the aircraft launched without conducting a normal mission brief or securing crucial mission essential related materials, including the no strike designations which would have identified the location of the MSF Trauma Center. Because this AC-130 aircraft and crew were ultimately not needed for the initial troops in contact mission, they were diverted in flight to provide close air support to the U.S. SOF commander in Kunduz. During the flight, the electronic systems on board the aircraft malfunctioned, preventing the operation of an essential command and control capability and eliminating the ability of the aircraft to transmit video, send and receive email, or send and receive electronic messages. This is an example of technical failure. In addition, as the aircraft arrived in the vicinity of Kunduz, the aircrew believed it was targeted by a missile, forcing the aircraft to move away from its normal orbit to an orbit approximately 8 miles from the mission area. This degraded the accuracy of certain targeting systems, which later contributed to the misidentification of the MSF Trauma Center. I'd like to refer you to the chart now in order to show you key locations as I describe the events. To give you some scale, the distance from the top to the bottom of this graphic is approximately 1,000 meters. The U.S. SOF commander on the ground was located at the Provincial Chief of Police compound, depicted by the green dot in the upper right of the chart. Through his Joint Terminal Attack Controller, or JTAC, the U.S. SOF commander provided the aircraft with the correct coordinates to the NDS headquarters building, the intended target of the Afghan SOF. The green one depicts the location of the NDS compound. Again, this was a building that the U.S. SOF commander intended to strike. But when the aircrew entered the coordinates into their fire control systems, the coordinates correlated to an open field over 300 meters from the NDS headquarters. The yellow 2 on the chart depicts the location of the open field. This mistake happened because the aircraft was several miles beyond its normal orbit and its sensors were degraded at that distance. The investigating officer found that the aircrew visually located the closest, largest building near the open field, which we now know was the MSF Trauma Center. The MSF Trauma Center is depicted by the red 3 on the chart. The physical description of the NDS headquarters building provided by the Afghan SOF to the U.S. SOF commander roughly matched the description of the MSF Trauma Center as seen by the aircrew. At night, the aircrew was unable to identify any signs of the hospital's protected status. This second chart shows the MSF facility pre-strike. This is what the aircrew was able to visualize, although it would have been seeing the facility at night. According to the report, the aircrew concluded, based on the JTAC's description of a large building near field, that the MSF Trauma Center was the NDS headquarters. Tragically, this misidentification continued throughout the remainder of the operation, even though there were some contradictory indicators. For example, once the aircraft returned to its original orbit, the aircraft's grid location system correctly aligned with the NDS facility instead of the open field. However, the crew remained fixated on the physical description of the facility and at that point did not rely on the grid coordinate. Also, the investigators found that the aircrew did not observe hostile activity at the MSF Trauma Center. These are examples of human and procedural errors. The report determined that as the operation proceeded, the U.S. SOF commander, through the JTAC, requested the aircraft to engage a building that the aircrew mistakenly believed was the NDS headquarters. The report found that under the circumstances, the U.S. SOF commander lacked the authority to direct the aircrew to engage the facility. The investigation also found that the U.S. SOF commander relied primarily upon information provided by Afghan partners and was unable to distinguish between the NDS headquarters building and the MSF Trauma Center. According to the report, 1 minute prior to firing, the aircrew transmitted to their operational headquarters at Bagram Airfield that they were about to engage the building. They provided the coordinates for the MSF Trauma Center as their target. The headquarters was aware of the coordinates for the MS Trauma Center and had access to the no-strike list, but did not realize that the grid coordinates for the target matched a location on the no-strike list, or that the aircrew was preparing to fire on the hospital. This confusion was exacerbated by the lack of video and electronic communications between the headquarters and the aircraft, caused by the earlier malfunction and a belief at the headquarters that the force on the ground required air support as a matter of immediate force protection. The strike began at 2:08 a.m. At 2:20 a.m., a SOF officer at Bagram received a call from MSF advising that their facility was under attack. It took the headquarters and the U.S. Special Operations Commander until 2:37 a.m. to realize a fatal mistake. At that time, the AC-130 had already ceased firing. The strike lasted for approximately 29 minutes. This is an example of human and process error. The investigation found that the strike resulted in the death of 30 staff, patient, and assistants, and the injury of 37 others. U.S. Forces Afghanistan is currently working hand in hand with MSF to identify the injured and the families of those who lost loved ones in order that we may offer appropriate condolences. Based upon the information learned during the investigation, the report determined that the proximate cause of this tragedy was the direct result of avoidable human error, compounded by process and equipment failures. In addition, the report found that fatigue and a high operational tempo contributed to this tragedy. It also identified failures in systems and processes that, while not the cause of the strike on the MSF Trauma Center, contributed to the incident. These included the loss of electronic communication systems on the aircraft, the nature of the planning and approval process employed during operations in Kunduz City, and the lack of a single system to vet proposed targets against a no-strike list. We have reviewed each of these failures and implemented corrections as appropriate. We have learned from this terrible incident. We will also take appropriate administrative and disciplinary action through a process that is fair and thoroughly considers the available evidence. The cornerstone of our military justice system is the independence of decision makers following a thorough investigation such as this one. We will study what went wrong and take the right steps to prevent it in the future. As I said in an earlier statement, this was a tragic mistake. U.S. forces would never intentionally strike a hospital or other protected facilities. Our deepest condolences go to all of the individuals and families that were affected by this tragic incident. We will offer our assistance to Doctors Without Borders in rebuilding the hospital in Kunduz. Doctors Without Borders is a respected humanitarian organization that does important life-saving work, not only within Afghanistan, but around the world. Alongside our Afghan partners, we will work to assist and support them in this critical role that they play in this country. Again, thank you very much for your time. I will be followed by General Schaffner as he will take your questions.
Good evening, ladies and gentlemen, and good morning to those of you joining us from Washington, D.C. I'm Brigadier General Wilson Schaffner, the spokesman for Resolute Support in U.S. Forces Afghanistan. Regarding the investigation, what we've said from the beginning is that we are determined to ensure this investigation is both thorough and transparent. The fact that we're even doing this press conference today is unusual, but as Secretary Carter has said, we're committed to ensuring full accountability on this incident. This investigation is an important step, but it is only one step in the overall process. U.S. authorities may determine that additional investigations are required, and if so, that process will take additional time. We also have to ensure the due process for anyone who may be involved in this process. In an effort to be transparent, we're going to share everything that we possibly can at this point. Once the investigation is redacted, the full report will be posted to the U.S. Central Command website, and we'll provide you a link to that at the completion of this press conference. At this time, I will take your questions, and Lynn O'Donnell, let's start with you.
Thank you. You're talking about suspensions and following the due process, etc. It sounds like a lot of violations, multiple violations of the rules of law here, dressed up as human error. There is a chain of command. There has to be a point of responsibility. Where does the buck stop? Does it stop with General Campbell, who took his authorities directly from the president? Are we looking at him being forced or even as a matter of honour offering his resignation? The other thing that interests me about this is that Afghan officials have said all along that the hospital, they have specifically referred to the hospital as the command and control centre for the insurgents. So, you know, where did the NDS come into this? In the process of making the decision whether or not to continue with the attack, where did the NDS come into this? And in terms of, you know, it seems like a contradiction. So I'm just wondering what impact will this whole incident have on the level of trust between US, NATO and Afghan forces going forward? Because you have to work very closely going forward.
To the first part of your question, the investigation found that some individuals involved did not follow the rules of engagement. In terms of what happens next, as I said, the investigation itself is an important step in the process, but it is just one step toward full accountability. Based on his findings, the investigating officer made several recommendations. General Campbell has decided to retain some of those recommendations at his level, and he has referred others to the commander of the U.S. SOCOM for his review and action as appropriate. The individuals most closely associated with the incident have been suspended from their duty positions. I won't comment on the recommendations that have been made while those reviews are underway, and I won't comment on individual cases that are underway, as we have to allow for due process for those involved, and we must allow for the independent review by the decision makers involved. To the second part of your question, I won't speak for Minister Staniczai, but I will point out that on the civilian casualty assessment team investigation that was done, that wasn't just a U.S. investigation, it was a NATO investigation. The members of the team consisted of coalition partners, U.S. and non-U.S. It consisted of 7 Afghans that were appointed by President Ghani. On the civilian casualty assessment team, I need to point out the purpose of that was different from the 15-6. It was intentionally narrow in purpose. It was designed to determine the basic facts and then to validate whether or not the civilian casualties had occurred. It did that. And the results of the civilian casualty assessment team report informed the 15-6 investigation. As to your final statement or your final question, we remain committed to working with our Afghan partners to help them build sustainable security in Afghanistan. Thank you.
Ron Northern, New York Times. Can you tell us how many individuals were suspended? And also, was General Campbell himself interviewed by the investigators?
All I can tell you is that some individuals have been suspended from their duty positions. I can also say that U.S. authorities may direct additional investigations to determine whether further actions are warranted regarding actions of specific individuals that were involved. Should additional investigations be required, Those will be made public once complete and redacted. Again, we have a responsibility to ensure due process for those involved.
And General Campbell, was he interviewed by the investigators?
I won't comment on General Campbell's position as he is reviewing some of the recommendations that have been made in his capacity as the appointing officer for the investigation.
So we have the Pentagon on the line. I'd like to go to the Pentagon at this time.
Okay.
Roger, can you hear us at the Pentagon?
We hear you just fine. Can you hear us?
Can you hear me? Yeah.
Yeah, we got you. Go ahead.
Hello, this is Bob Burns from Associated Press, General. Question for you about, you referred to the rules of engagement were violated. Aside from reaching the point where there were a combination of human error and other malfunctions, was the basic decision to use air power under these circumstances justified given the non-combat role that the U.S. Assumed at the end of 2014? In other words, there are very limited, narrow circumstances under which the use of force is permitted. And did this fit that circumstance? Thank you.
Under certain circumstances, U.S. assets can be used to support Afghan forces if they request air support. Ultimately, that decision is in the hands of a U.S. commander. I won't get into the specific rules of engagement on that, but I will tell you that we are determined to learn the right lessons from this. We're committed to ensuring that this doesn't happen again. We will evaluate all the recommendations in this report and use them to improve our systems and our processes. We take all reports of civilian casualties seriously, and we review each one of them thoroughly. General Campbell has already directed a thorough review of our planning process as well as our targeting process. This will take place at all echelons of command, and we will conduct a thorough examination of how we develop and how we use no-strike lists.
General, a very quick follow-up from Bob Burns. Do I understand your answer to mean that no, this was not the proper circumstance under which to use combat power? Is that what you're saying?
The investigation found that some of the U.S. individuals involved did not follow the rules of engagement.
Jim Miklashevsky from NBC News.
General, Doctors Without Borders, which has proven to be a pretty reliable source in regard to what happened there in Kunduz, said that they made at least 2 phone calls, one just prior to and one during the airstrike, to the Pentagon. And we've been told that that information was relayed from Joint Staff to the NMCC, that they were under attack. Did that information ever reach the operators there in the battlefield?
What I'd like to do is, to better answer that question, just briefly review the sequence of events leading up to the issue at hand. Approximately 12 minutes after the firing commenced, Doctors Without Borders called to report the attack. Unfortunately, by the time U.S. forces realized the mistake, the aircraft had stopped firing. It's important to remember that this was a complicated and a chaotic situation. The AC-130 had already been shot at by a surface-to-air missile. U.S. personnel at the time were focused on doing what they had been trained to do. That said, chaos does not justify this tragedy. Let me be very clear. We did not intentionally strike the hospital. We are absolutely heartbroken over what has occurred here, and we will do absolutely everything in our power to make sure that it does not happen again. You mentioned Doctors Without Borders. We have great respect for the important and life-saving work Doctors Without Borders does in Afghanistan and around the world. We're committed to working with them. We're committed to helping them, as General Campbell mentioned, rebuild the hospital and provide condolence payments for those affected by this terrible tragedy. We appreciate their dedication toward easing the suffering of those affected by conflict, and we will do everything within our power to enable their efforts.
Let's take one last one for the Pentagon before we lose the connection. Go Pentagon, go ahead.
General, just a couple of quick follow-ups. Did the flight crew aboard the AC-130 ever express any concern or question the validity or legality of the target they were about to strike? And if there were so many problems with systems and with comms and with identifying targets, why was that attack allowed to proceed?
I'll tell you that the investigation found that some of the U.S. individuals involved did not follow the rules of engagement.
Tom Bowman from NPR.
General Tom Bowman, a couple of questions. One was the MSF called, it looks like less than halfway into this attack, and it took 17 minutes, you guys say, for the commanders to realize they made a mistake. That's almost half the amount of time of the attack itself. Why did it take so long? Did you ever get an answer to that? And also, if there's no fire coming from the hospital, no clear threat, why would they think this was a legitimate target?
Well, the investigation found that the medical facility was misidentified as a target by U.S. personnel who believed that they were striking a different building several hundred meters away where there were reports of combatants. I think it might be helpful to put this in context. At the time of the incident, U.S. and Afghan forces in Kunduz had been fighting for 5 days when the incident occurred. Both U.S. and Afghan forces had reports of Taliban throughout the city of Kunduz. Again, we're determined to learn the right lessons, and we're committed to ensuring that this does not and cannot happen again. Let's go to a question here in Kabul.
We'll take the questions here in the room.
Yes.
Let's, TV, yeah, total TV.
This is Murat from to the news. Could you give us more details about the measures you are taking in the future as the Afghan forces need close air support and they need the U.S. close air support?
So Joe Campbell has already directed that all U.S. personnel in theater receive training on targeting authorities and on the rules of engagement. General Campbell has also directed that we conduct a comprehensive review of our planning process as well as our targeting process at all echelons of command. He's directed a thorough examination of how we develop and how we use no-strike lists.
May I continue?
You may, please. Do you have a follow-up?
Do you have a follow-up question?
You want to continue doing that kind of close air support to the Afghan forces in the future?
Again, I'll state that we remain committed to working closely with our Afghan allies as we assist them in their efforts to build sustainable security for this country.
Let's go to Siddhartha.
Yeah, Siddhartha Royman, Washington Post. A few hours before the MSF strike, the NDS building and buildings around it were actually struck by U.S. airstrikes. So the location was clearly known. So how do you account for this discrepancy? A few hours later, the coordinates shift, and as you say, the MSF hospital is mistaken for the NDS building, when just a few hours earlier there had been an attack, had been combat going on there, and there had been a strike in that area.
The investigation found that the U.S. Special Operations Forces commander did rely on information provided by the Afghan partners on the location of the NDS compound. However, the investigation determined that those grid coordinates given by the Afghan forces to that NDS compound were correct. And let me comment on just a minute on how we came to that conclusion. The investigative team went to great lengths to ensure a full and impartial accounting of the facts and the circumstances. They were driven by the need to be thorough, not by a timeline. Investigative team consisted of 3 general officers and a dozen subject matter experts. They spent a full 3 weeks completing their report. They visited the Doctors Without Borders site. They visited other sites within Kunduz. They interviewed over 65 witnesses, and they compiled over 3,000 pages of documentary evidence. They also visited and engaged with each echelon in the chain of command. We stand by their findings and recommendations, and we support the process by which they conducted the investigation.
Let's go to Kakar from Peshawar.
I'm Kakar from Peshawar, Afghanistan. The MSF, they are asking for free and fair international investigation. General Campbell said that he shared the finding with MSF officials. What was their response? Are they satisfied with this investigation?
I'm sorry, could you repeat the first part of your question?
MSF was asking free and fair international investigation. General Campbell said that they shared the finding with MSF officials. What was their response?
No, thank you. General Campbell did meet with representatives from Doctors Without Borders. When he met with them, they provided their initial review. General Campbell read and considered that initial review. He also gave it to the investigative team. They read it, and they considered that as they wrote their report. I'll also point out that the findings of the U.S. National Investigation, the 15-6, were consistent with that of the CCAT, the Combined Civilian Casualty Assessment Team. So again, we're confident with those 2 investigations coming to the same conclusions. We're confident in those findings.
Jennifer Glass from Al Jazeera. Are you going to allow an international independent investigation? General Campbell is the commanding officer and apparently also the adjudicating officer, and it seems the investigation team was all-American, but also the forces that went on to the attack was all-American. Is there any problem with that? While you say it's not intentional strike, that in no way abrogates the laws of the rule of war. Every U.S. serviceman from basic training all the way through and prior to deploying must review the basic laws of war, including proportionality and distinction. Even if you had struck the proper place, do you think that the attack was proportional? And in terms of, it's not just the rules of engagement, in terms of the basic laws of war, why would war training make things better?
The investigative team has completed a thorough investigation, and we're confident with the facts and the evidence collected. With regard to your question on the rules of engagement, the investigation...
Laws of war, not rules of engagement, laws of war.
I can tell you what the investigation found, and the investigation found that some of the U.S. individuals involved did not follow the rules of engagement. With regard to your question on proportionality, the investigation found that the actions of the aircrew and the Special Operations Forces were not appropriate to the threats that they faced. The investigating officer's recommendations on this have been referred to the proper authorities for disposition. I cannot comment further on that part as that matter is under review. Again, we did not intentionally strike the hospital, and we are absolutely heartbroken over what has happened here.
What about an independent investigation?
The investigative team has completed a thorough investigation.
An international independent investigation. MSF has called for it. The investigation panel has been activated. It's the UN mandated procedure in this situation when there's a humanitarian problem. They're ready to go, but they need the Americans and the Afghans to say yes, and it seems that you have said no.
We believe the investigation completed was full and impartial, and we stand by the findings and recommendations, and we support the process by which it was conducted.
Sorry, how can it be impartial when your commanding officer, your adjudicating officer, and the people investigating are in the same organization as the people who attacked?
Again, General Campbell has decided to refer some of the recommendations to the commander of U.S. SOCOM for his review and action as appropriate.
All right, let's go here to this gentleman.
This is not the first time that U.S. airstrikes cause civilian casualties. Previously, even the U.S. forces bombarded the ANA compound in Uyghur province just 1 year before, as I think. How do you show assurance that such kind of attack will not occur again?
Well, we're determined to learn the right lessons from this, and we're committed to ensuring it doesn't happen again. The civilian casualty assessment team process that I mentioned is part of this headquarters' procedures whenever we have an indication of civilian casualties or an allegation of civilian casualties. It provides us a means of looking into it very quickly to determine if further investigation is needed. If further investigation is needed, as it was in this case, that will be done, and we'll use that investigation as the basis for adjusting our systems and procedures so that this does not happen again. We have time for one more question.
Go to Jessica.
Afghan special forces say that they relate to U.S. special forces, that they were spying coming from the building. So when the building was hit, presumably Afghan forces would have seen whether the firing was continuing or not. So what kind of messaging was passed between the Afghan special forces and U.S. special forces at the time? And if they continue to report that there was firing from the building and in fact the wrong building was being targeted, can they be trusted as a partner when carrying out these kind of strikes?
Well, I can tell you that the investigation found that U.S. Special Operations Forces commander did rely on information provided by the Afghan partners. The investigation also found that that information was correct. As I've stated earlier, the investigation found that some of the U.S. individuals involved did violate the rules of engagement, and we'll take appropriate action on that.
Precautions. In international humanitarian law, you have to take precautions to protect civilians. Is that also violated along with the law of proportionality? Because it looks like your systems were not working. These systems were set up in order to protect civilians. They've been working for a long time.
The investigation found that the actions of the aircrew and the Special Operations Commander were not appropriate to the threats that they faced. The investigating officer's recommendations on this matter have been referred to the proper authorities for disposition, and I won't comment on that further. That's all the time I have for questions, but before I depart, I want to emphasize we made a terrible mistake that resulted in unnecessary deaths. We have been committed from the beginning to a transparent and thorough investigation, and we will do everything possible to prevent this from happening again. This investigation was an important step in this process, but it is just one step toward full accountability. And finally, we would never, ever do anything to harm innocent civilians. Thank you.
All right, thanks, everybody.
Thanks, Jeff.